When we struggle with imposter syndrome, we often worry about the risks of speaking up. What will others think? Will I sound smart enough or experienced enough? Will I make a fool of myself? But how often do we ask ourselves, what are the risks of not speaking up? This week, I speak with Dana Vogelmeier, a leadership consultant and former corporate leader, about how she navigated imposter syndrome during her career and the risks to ourselves and our organizations if we don't speak up. Thanks so much for listening and sharing with others. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help women and others overcome imposter syndrome and advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest to share how they've navigated self-doubt to achieve success. The more we share our stories, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us. Thank you so much for listening and sharing. Welcome, Dana. I am so excited. You and I have already started this conversation, so I can't wait to continue this conversation now as the official recording as we move forward with our discussion about imposter syndrome. Before we dive in, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk to you about this today. We have a shared passion in this particular topic, and it's a big one, but I would just kind of share a little bit from my background. I kind of grew up, if you will, in the world of corporate America. I worked 33 years for the same organization. It was a Fortune 50 company. And when I started, I was like entry level. Like there's no job more entry level than the job I started in. And I went to work there because they offered tuition reimbursement, and that was my driver. So I was going to school at night to work on my degree, and it took me 7.5 years, but I did complete it and just kind of worked my way up and eventually moved into a leadership role. And I had actually spent 25 years in leadership while I was there. But during that time, I had a lot of wonderful leaders, and I had some average leaders, and then I had just a few that were not that great. And I started examining the different teams and the different interactions and what was making some of those teams just magical, and then others that just really struggled to find some harmony. And so I started looking really at workplace culture, employee engagement, and just relationship dynamics and connecting with your people that you work with and how that can really rise, the whole group of outcomes that the team experiences. So in some of my work around utilizing your leadership voice, imposter syndrome comes up a lot. So I love this particular topic, and I'm excited to talk about it with you today.
Oh, I'm excited too. I can't wait. And so I'll ask you the standard opening questions that I like to ask everyone, which are, what does imposter syndrome mean to you? And how, if at all, has it shown up in your life?
So yes, it's shown up a few times, but really what it means to me is that we sometimes feel like we don't deserve to be in the spot we're in or talking about the topic that we're talking about, or in a particular meeting that for whatever reason, we feel that we're not worthy of being there, or we've not earned our spot there or seat at the table. And it doesn't even change the fact that sometimes maybe we've already had some good success, or maybe we've been at that table before. But sometimes there's different topics or different people, and that changes the dynamics in the room. So we have to constantly remind ourselves that we have done work, we have had good results, and we do deserve to have our voices heard at that particular table. And I think that the first place that it showed up for me, where I really kind of recognized it, not that labeled as imposter syndrome, because I didn't know that language at the time, but where I afterwards was really like examining the whole situation. I had just moved from kind of out in the field. I was working at State Farm Insurance at the time, and I was what you would call out in the field, moved to corporate. And so here's my first time at like a big corporate meeting, and being around the table with all these people that I don't know them and they don't know me. But I was working on a really big project. It was a countrywide rollout of this new department. And so there were a lot of people in these meetings, and I'd only been there a few months. So I was still trying to learn how to work like in corporate, in the corporate way of getting things done. And I had had success in the field, but not at corporate. So I was brought into this meeting because everybody that led a particular slice of the project was going to go up on stage. It was like in an auditorium, and kind of talk about where their piece of the project was. And there was a project manager, and he was asking questions. And so when I went up, I felt okay. I was like, okay, I don't love being up here on this stage, feeling like everybody's looking at me, but I felt like I knew what I was talking about. And I did know what I was talking about for about 50% of the questions. But when he started asking things that I just had no idea, I felt myself like internally shrinking and just like even getting a little sweaty and just nervous and embarrassed. And I came off of stage and just, internally in my mind, and, this swirl like down the drain, like, oh my gosh, this is all over. They found me out. They know I'm not really right for this job. They're going to send me back. None of this is good. My life is over. No one ever hired me again. My husband's going to leave me, just
catastrophizing. Yes.
Just like everything is going to happen wrong as a result of this one thing. And, of course, that's not what happened, but that feeling just of like, oh my gosh. So when it was over, I had a conversation with my boss. And again, didn't have this language at the time, but what I realize now is that I did have some psychological safety there. And my boss said, how do you think that went? We talked about it. And the great thing is he said, okay, so now you know what to expect the next time. So, there's going to be another walkthrough in 30 days. Let's get ready. And we did. And I was ready the next time. So a lot less scared, knew what kind of questions were going to be asked. But, that experience really shaped me in kind of preparing for meetings in the future and having all my ducks in a row and asking questions before the meeting to get me prepared. And that kind of helped eliminate some of that imposter syndrome as I progressed.
So you brought up so many interesting things in that one story, right? This story itself of the situation of thinking you're fairly comfortable, right? But then as soon as that one question comes that you're not prepared for, and then certainly when there are more of them, that feeling of just thinking, oh no, right? Like I thought I could do this, but I can't. And I think that is a perfect example of how so many of us have felt. There's a certain amount of preparation that you can do ahead of time, but a certain amount of time when you just don't know what to expect and you're going to be thrown into the deep end, right? But what I think is interesting is that you had a manager that basically said, okay, let's get ready for the next time. Didn't make you feel like you had hugely failed, right?
Right.
This was all like kind of in your own head, right? You had runway to do it more confidently the next time. And you said something else that, ask questions ahead of time. That's another big one, I think. So I think that there's so many different, like the before, during, and after of this process is really important. And unfortunately, I think we all learn the hard way. You just don't know what you don't know. And when you're early in your career, you've never been in a situation, you do what you can, and then you learn and you keep getting better and better. So I think that's a great example of just kind of, but then dealing with it in a
Yeah. I agree. I think we learn the most from our quote unquote failures.
Mm-hmm.
And to I loved your words, because in my mind, it was much more of a failure than it really was in reality. But I was the one experiencing it. Yeah. So, but those are really, really teachable moments. And I think for those of us who are good kind of reflectors or processing information, looking back and assessing what happened, you can learn so much from those situations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned psychological safety, right? Which I think is so crucial to this too, because there's a certain amount of anxiety that I think many of us high achievers carry around with us. I certainly speak from personal experience, right? That I am put very high standards on myself. I want to always perform at the highest level, but the stakes change or the pressure level changes when you don't feel safe, right? Can you talk a little bit more about psychological safety, especially in the context of what's interesting about what you were describing in terms of culture and dynamics and all of interpersonal dynamics, all of that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I love to read about this topic too, psychological safety, because I think it plays such a huge role in the outcomes in organizations. Because if people don't feel psychologically safe, then they're not going to take risks. They're oftentimes won't come up to their leader to say, I think something's going on over there that maybe somebody should look into, maybe someone's stealing from the organization or whatever. But that psychological safety is, if you feel it, then you have a comfort level and you know that you're not going to be fired for one mistake. But sometimes people think that's exactly what's going to happen. And there was a real life situation many years ago from Enron, if you remember Enron. And one of the executives, her name was Sharon Watkins, and she was very high up in the organization on sort of like the financial side of things and the strategy side of things. And she started recognizing a lot of irregularities in the accounting and just things not looking right. And she brought them to her leader's attention. And so in her mind, she had some psychological safety. She thought they would want to know this. And over time, kind of came to realize that maybe they don't care about that. Like maybe they're driving that way of working. And then it became, Enron went bankrupt and a lot of people lost a lot of money and it became a congressional investigation and actually executives went to jail. But when she kind of reported it, she definitely felt some psychological safety, but she was a little fearful. And then after she brought it to their attention and a little bit of time passed, she wasn't demoted or fired or anything like that, but she was moved to another role and her work was kind of taken away from her and given like other littler work. And she was actually physically moved out of one office that was like on like the 35th floor. I'm not sure exactly what floor it was, but very high up with all the other executives and was put down on the 16th floor. And she tells some wonderful stories of this on video. So if anybody's interested in just Googling her and listening, it's amazing because she said even her furniture was like probably old that had been recycled or something. And it was just kind of very telling to her what the situation was.
Message was clear.
Yes. She was, her conversations were unwelcomed.
Well, and it's interesting because you say that naturally she probably thought that this is something that people would appreciate that she brings to their attention, but clearly there were nefarious things going on behind the scenes, right? And so I think that we all have our own interpretation of what the system will allow. And I think in many cases we overestimate or overinflate the risk of speaking up. In this case, she kind of underinflated it, right? And experienced the unfortunate consequences of that. But she did the right thing, right? And I think that's something that has kind of characterized her or defined her ever since. And you and I were talking a little bit about this before we hit record, of this idea of purpose and values and things like that, right? As drivers, when you are feeling nervous or anxious about, should I speak up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for her, bringing this to the attention, and she even had a conversation later with one of the executives about this isn't going to end well. This isn't going to last long. And at some point, having Enron on our resumes is not going to be a good thing because it looks like this company was just a big hoax. And, so she was kind of thinking about her future, but everybody's future, but also like, this isn't going to end. Like she was kind of raising the flag. This is not going to end well. So we need to address it. And I think, to your point about purpose, Kim, I love that piece of this. And when people think about what if I do say something, what might happen? What if I don't say something, what's going to happen? And there's another really good example of this imposter syndrome, but also purpose driven. Speaking Up by Madeleine Albright, the very first time after she became Secretary of State, when she was in a meeting with a lot of other leaders from around the world. And she was sitting at a table and they all had their nameplates in front of them, and hers said United States of America. She was the only woman in the room. And she kind of assessed the situation, but the meeting began. Few people were saying some things. And in her mind, she thought, if I don't speak up today, then the United States of America will not be heard. And that's what I need to do. So even if she was nervous, even if she felt like maybe I don't belong here, she had to speak up so that the United States was represented in this world meeting.
I love that story so much. And it just also shows her sense of commitment and responsibility to the role, right? And I think that's something that we can all think about in probably lower profile situations.
Yes.
Their lives, right? But just this idea of what gets lost when I don't speak up, because you made a really good point when you said, oftentimes we think, what happens if I do speak up? And we're so focused on the potential consequences of speaking up, but we don't balance that with what happens if I don't? What is the risk? What is the potential consequence of not speaking up, even when I feel like maybe I don't belong here, or I'm not so sure that I have the perfect message to deliver right now.
Right. And there could be, depending on the organization and what you're working on, I mean, there could be like life-threatening repercussions of something like this. And I don't recall the details of like there was one of the NASA shuttle explosions where there was an analyst, like kind of a professional level employee, but who didn't feel comfortable with the power dynamic in a meeting of speaking up. He had already brought something up and it was like, oh, it's okay. We know about that. It's going to be fine. So when there was like the final meeting before it got ready to take off, he didn't feel comfortable bringing it up here because he had already brought it up in his like smaller leadership, amongst his leadership. And so later when he tells the story, and I wish I could remember his name, but when he tells the story, he talks about that. I wish I had brought it up at that second meeting. Mm. I brought it up at the first one and it was, addressed. So if you look at it that way, it was addressed from what he understood. But at the final meeting, he didn't bring it up. And, it did cost people their lives. And, so you kind of carry that. And while many of us don't work in something that's, like that, or, speaking up for the country or something like that, it still can have some repercussions, like in Enron's case of people losing their money and their retirement and their livelihood. And it could also be you didn't speak up to bring in even like a new idea that could have been really wonderful for the organization. So we just have to get comfortable with using our leadership voice and sharing what we have to say or think.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, based on your experience, having been with the same organization for so many years and navigating your own journey through leadership, for anybody who struggles with this, are there baby steps that you think can be taken? Because sometimes I know the examples that we're giving are pretty dramatic in terms of their consequences and everything, but they're great illustrations of the concepts that we're talking about. But in everyday life, if somebody's maybe just generally feeling a little bit out of place, or I'm not quite sure if this is the right time to speak up, or if I have the authority to do so, anything that you would recommend as just like a very first step?
Yeah, I think that from the very first step, I would think about doing some kind of self-assessment, especially with things like your own emotional intelligence, of your self-awareness, but also kind of reading the room a little bit and seeing kind of where others are. Because at some point, I'm kind of thinking like if you're sort of new to your role or to the company or something, you are always assessing. And when you can look to find a trusted advisor, just somebody that you can have a little bit of conversation with ahead of time, maybe before you take it to a larger room or a larger meeting, and just bounce some things off. But you do have to figure out who that person is. And it might not always be the person that you report to. So maybe it's a peer of theirs or a peer of yours, or someone you worked with in another department if you're still in the same company. And so I would definitely say, that was helpful for me. Having been in the same organization for so long, I had that kind of network, if you will, of just people that I really admired and trusted, that I could talk to about certain things and just look for some advice. The other thing is to think about, when you're getting ready maybe to bring something forward, is to practice it out loud and try to think of it from all the way around, because there could be things you don't know. So sometimes it's okay to even start the conversation with, from what I'm seeing, or even just putting that waiver on the back end if it's sensitive, that, there might be something about this that I'm not aware of. There are times where I think you don't want to belittle your words, but if there could be stuff that you're not aware of, it's okay to say that. And then it's almost like a little safer to bring up the conversation at that point.
I agree with you. I definitely agree that there's a difference between what you're describing and this might sound stupid, but right. But I really like that idea too, of just getting the perspectives of other influencers, people that are politically astute or are going to be able to help guide you through the process, because it is uncomfortable. There are unknowns. We can't predict everything. And so it's helpful to not feel like we have to do this entirely on our own.
Right. It kind of creates your own safety net. And, to your point about like the kind of even the politicalness within an organization, every organization has its own kind of political culture inside. And I don't mean that from a negative perspective, but it's part of everything. So knowing it and understanding it and being able to read it and also kind of read the tea leaves a little bit, you can start to know and develop where you need to get some intel ahead of time, or have some practice conversations, and who's safe to have that conversation with.
Absolutely. And I think, just given that we talked about Enron, which is in sort of the classic example.
Yes, it is.
I do think it's also interesting to think about this in the context of, the whistleblower that you mentioned, Sharon Watkins, and this feeling that many of us have of failure or getting it wrong, that if we speak up and for political reasons, that's not what they, whoever they are, right, we're looking for, or there's some negative consequence to what we're doing, but we are coming from a place of, this is what I genuinely believe. These are my core values. This is what I stand for. I think it's also really important to be able to process that not as a personal failure, but as a warning signal that maybe this is not the right environment for me. And I don't think that's typically where we go when that happens. I think we typically self-blame and think, oh, I miscalculated or I did something wrong. But sometimes if you can't speak up, or if you are consistently bumping into these roadblocks, it could mean that you're not in the right place.
Yeah. Oh, I love that, because I totally agree. And one of the situations, or one of the teams that I worked on, where I definitely did not feel like in the right place. I didn't click with the leader that I had. And it felt very much, it was a it was a dynamic and a culture where, like, even he said the words to me, like, don't rock the boat.
Mm.
They're like, don't bring new ideas. Don't try to be innovative. Don't bring attention to us. Just don't rock the boat. Just keep it going. And, prior to that, as a leader, I always felt like your role as a leader is to make things better, to improve the processes or the product or whatever it is you're working on, but also to develop the people. And sometimes that means some risks of giving them development opportunities or switching up roles, but he didn't want any attention brought to the department. He just was kind of biding his time because he thought he was going to move up to the next level. And in one situation, we were several of us in a meeting, and there was only one manager in that level, like in this group that we were talking to, one female manager. And he took a project from her and gave it to someone else, really without explanation. And she was kind of like, I've been working on that. And he said, well, I'm going to have so-and-so do it instead. And it was uncomfortable for everyone. Just like there wasn't rhyme or reason to it. So later, I spoke with her, and she actually reported to me at that time. And I spoke with her, and she's like, why did I get taken away? And did I do something wrong? And I said, let me find out. Maybe there's something I don't know. Let me find out what's going on, and I'll get back with you. So I had some conversation with him about it. And, he didn't use the words, I don't like her, but it was clear. And he said, I just want the other guy to work on it. I want Mike to work on it. And I said, well, I think she feels like she must have done something wrong. And, she's like in trouble or being punished for doing something wrong. She's just not feeling good about it. And he said, I don't care how she feels. Yes. And so that was like, boom, like, just like you said, sometimes you don't feel like you're in the right place. Like the sirens went off, the lights were flaring, blowing. And I was just like, oh, what do you mean you don't care how she feels? And I couldn't even comprehend that. I thought, well, my goodness. So anyway, over time, other things came up too. And it was just like, this is not going to work for me. And so I ended up moving over to another department, and probably not soon enough, but it's okay. I learned a lot of valuable lessons during that time of what not to do and what to do. But even though it was hard going through all that, and also kind of the bumps that other people felt kind of hurt my heart too, it was still just really good learning. And coming out on the other side of it, I felt like that definitely made me a better leader.
Absolutely. And I think when you're in it too, there is a tendency to want to give people the benefit of the doubt. You're hoping that it's not as bad as you think it is. Right. So, but you're right. Like once we finally reach the point where we remove ourselves from the situation, I've learned so much from the people that I didn't think were great leaders, because obviously it's painful when you're going through it, but I do think that there's a lot to be learned about what you don't want or what's not the right way to go about leading, as there is from watching the people who do it well.
For sure. And, kind of back from where we started too, I had some really good leadership success. And so when all of a sudden I'm up against this new issue and new experience and it's not going well, I start thinking, what am I doing wrong? And, kind of going back to reaching out, getting advice from others maybe who've been through this situation. So, I was given some advice about how to lead up, and kind of modeling what it is that you'd like to see that person do. And so I tried leading up. I don't know if there was ever any transference, over to the other person. I never witnessed it, but I was just kind of hoping maybe over time, because eventually I moved to another department, but all of the people that reported to me left and went to other departments too. Mm-hmm. So, I would think that you might look at the turnover and say, why is everyone leaving?
Exactly.
And so I don't know if he ever did, I don't know.
And he may not have ever been put in a situation where he either had to examine his own behavior or had to be held accountable for anything. So yeah, that's really unfortunate too. I do think, that message of, you mentioned being told, don't rock the boat, right? We all know when something is out of sync with who we are or what we value, and to really pay attention to those cues, to our instincts, and not interpret them once again as I'm not good enough or I'm doing something wrong, but more so of, this just isn't the right place for me. And I don't think we all know not every place is going to be right for every person. And that doesn't mean you failed.
I totally agree. Yeah. Not every company is for every person, not every team, not every leader is for every person. Totally agree.
Yeah. So I love this conversation so much. And I have no doubt that you and I could keep going for a long time, but what are you hoping people will take away from this conversation?
Well, I hope that people, as they're listening, are kind of thinking about some of their own experiences that they've had and reflecting on maybe what went well, what didn't go as well, and maybe what I could do differently. And then also just understanding we all go through it. I equate it a little bit, the vulnerability of it to the lessons of the lobster. The lobster actually sheds its shell, and then its little body is exposed and very vulnerable, but it has to shed. It has to go through this vulnerable experience in order to grow back a harder, stronger, bigger shell so it can be bigger and better the next time. And that's what we do as people and as leaders. We have vulnerable experiences like being on a stage and not knowing the answers to the questions, and your shell is coming off. It is very exposed and you feel very vulnerable. But because of that experience, I did get better for the next time. And that's what everybody does. So not to be hard on ourselves when we have those failures and we start feeling like maybe we're not the right person for this conversation or this job or whatever. You are. And you just have to do the best you can, get prepared, get the good guidance that you need, do your homework, and it works out.
I love that, Dana. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Me too, Kim. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you're listening to this, chances are you struggle with imposter syndrome or other confidence issues too. Please know that you are in great company. As an executive coach and former high-tech leader, I spent years battling imposter syndrome. There were times in my corporate life when I was absolutely sure that this was the moment that everyone would figure out that I didn't belong in the room. But it never happened. And through the years, with the help of research, coaching, and other resources, I've learned to help myself and others overcome self-doubt and advance our careers with strength and confidence. If you'd like to continue this conversation, please join my Leading Women Facebook group, where women of diverse roles, levels, and backgrounds come together to ask questions, share challenges, and support one another in a safe, trusted space that's difficult to find in the workplace. Check out the link in the show notes for more information on how to find us. And please join us again next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.